Chapter 21 of Mary Barton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephanie Dupal de Martin. Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 21. Esther's Motive in Seeking Mary. My rest is gone, my heart is sore. Peace find I never, and nevermore. Margaret's Song in Faust. I must go back a little to explain the motives which caused Esther to seek an interview with her niece. The murder had been committed early on Thursday night, and between then and the dawn of the following day, there was ample time for the news to spread far and wide among all those whose duty, or whose want, or whose errors, caused them to be abroad in the streets of Manchester. Among those who listened to the tale of violence was Esther. A craving desire to know more took possession of her mind. Far away as she was from Turner Street, she immediately set off to the scene of the murder, which was faintly lighted by the grey dawn as she reached the spot. It was so quiet and still that she could hardly believe it to be the place. The only vestige of any scuffle or violence was a trail in the dust, as if somebody had been lying there, and then been raised by extraneous force. The little birds were beginning to hop and twitter in the leafless hedge, making the only sound that was near and distinct. She crossed into the field where she guessed the murderer to have stood. It was easy of access, for the worn, stunted hawthorn edge had many gaps in it. The night smell of the bruised grass came up from under her feet, as she went towards the saw-pit and carpenter's shed, which, as I have said before, were in a corner of the field near the road, and where one of her informants had told her it was supposed by the police that the murderer had lurked while waiting for his victim. There was no sign, however, that anyone had been about the place. If the grass had been bruised or bent where he had trod, it had had enough of the elasticity of life to raise itself under the dewy influences of night. She hushed her breath in involuntary awe, but nothing else told of the violent deed by which a fellow creature had passed away. She stood still for a minute, imagining to herself the position of the parties, guided by the only circumstance which afforded any evidence, the trailing mark on the dust in the road. Suddenly, it was before the sun had risen above the horizon, she became aware of something white in the hedge. All other colors wore the same murky hue, though the forms of objects were perfectly distinct. What was it? It could not be a flower. That the time of year made clear. A frozen lump of snow, lingering late in one of the gnarled tufts of the hedge. She stepped forward to examine. It proved to be a little piece of stiff writing paper compressed into a round shape. She understood it instantly. It was the paper that had served as wadding for the murderer's gun. Then she had been standing just where the murderer must have been but a few hours before. Probably, as the rumor had spread through the town, reaching her ears, one of the poor maddened turnouts, who hung about everywhere with black, fierce looks, as if contemplating some deed of violence. Her sympathy was all with them, for she had known what they suffered, and besides this, there was her own individual dislike of Mr. Carson, and dread of him for Mary's sake. Yet, poor Mary! Death was a terrible, though sure, remedy for the evil Esther had dreaded for her, and how would she stand the shock, loving as her aunt believed her to do? Poor Mary! Who would comfort her? Esther's thoughts began to picture her sorrow, her despair, when the news of her lover's death should reach her, and she longed to tell her there might have been a keener grief yet had he lived. Bright, beautiful came the slanting rays of the morning sun. It was time for such as she to hide themselves, with the other obscene things of night, from the glorious light of day, which was only for the happy. So she turned her steps towards town, still holding the paper. But in getting over the hedge, it encumbered her to hold it in her clasped hand, and she threw it down. She passed on a few steps, her thoughts still of Mary, till the idea crossed her mind, could it, blank as it appeared to be, give any clue to the murderer? As I said before, her sympathies were all on that side, so she turned back and picked it up. And then, feeling as if in some measure an accessory, she hid it unexamined in her hand, and hastily passed out of the street at the opposite end to that by which she had entered it. And what do you think she felt when, having walked some distance from the spot, she dared to open the crushed paper, and saw written on it Mary Barton's name, and not only that, but the street in which she lived? True, a letter or two was torn off, but nevertheless, there was the name clear to be recognized. And oh, what a terrible thought flashed into her mind! Or was it only fancy? But it looked very like the writing which she had once known well, the writing of Jem Wilson, who, when she lived at her brother-in-law's, and he was a near neighbour, had often been employed by her to write her letters to people, to whom she was ashamed of sending her own misspelled scrawl. She remembered the wonderful flourishes she had so much admired in those days, while she sat by dictating, and Jem, in all the pride of newly acquired penmanship, used to dazzle her eyes by extraordinary graces and twirls. If it were his! Oh, perhaps it was merely that her head was running so on Mary, that she was associating every trifle with her, as if only one person wrote in that flourishing, meandering style. It was enough to fill her mind to think from what she might have saved Mary by securing the paper. She would look at it just once more, and see if some very dense and stupid policeman could have mistaken the name, or if Mary would certainly have been dragged into notice in the affair. No, no one could have mistaken the Re Barton, and it was Jem's handwriting. Oh, if it was so, she understood it all, and she had been the cause. With her violent and unregulated nature, rendered morbid by the course of life she led, and her consciousness of her degradation, she cursed herself for the interference which she believed had led to this, for the information and the warning she had given to Jem, which had roused him to this murderous action. How could she, the abandoned and polluted outcast, ever have dared to hope for a blessing, even on her efforts to do good? The black curse of heaven rested on all her doings, were they for good or for evil. Poor diseased mind, and there were none to minister to thee. So she wandered about, too restless to take her usual heavy morning sleep, up and down the streets, greedily listening to every word of the passers-by, and loitering near each group of talkers, anxious to scrape together every morsel of information, or conjecture, or suspicion, though without possessing any definite purpose in all this. And ever and always she clenched the scrap of paper which might betray so much, until her nails had deeply indented the palm of her hand, so fearful was she in her nervous dread lest unawares she should let it drop. Towards the middle of the day she could no longer evade the body's craving want of rest and refreshment, but the rest was taken in a spirit vault, and the refreshment was a glass of gin. Then she started up from the stupor she had taken for repose, and suddenly driven before the gusty impulses of her mind, she pushed her way to the place where at that very time the police were bringing the information they had gathered with regard to the all-engrossing murder. She listened with painful acuteness of comprehension to dropped words and unconnected sentences, the meaning of which became clearer and yet more clear to her. Jem was suspected. Jem was ascertained to be the murderer. She saw him, although he, absorbed in deep, sad thought, saw her not. She saw him brought handcuffed and guarded out of the coach. She saw him enter the station. She gasped for breath till he came out, still handcuffed and still guarded, to be conveyed to the New Bailey. He was the only one who had spoken to her with hope that she might win her way back to virtue. His words had lingered in her heart with a sort of call to heaven, like distant Sabbath bells, although in her despair she had turned away from his voice. He was the only one who had spoken to her kindly. The murder, shocking though it was an absent, abstract thing, on which her thoughts could not and would not dwell. All that was present in her mind was Jem's danger, and his kindness. Then Mary came to remembrance. Esther wondered till she was sick of wondering, in what way she was taking the affair. In some manner it would be a terrible blow for the poor motherless girl, with her dreadful father, too, who was to Esther a sort of accusing angel. She set off towards the court where Mary lived, to pick up what she could there of information. But she was ashamed to enter in where once she had been innocent, and hung about the neighbouring streets, not daring to question, so she learnt but little, nothing in fact, but the knowledge of John Barton's absence from home. She went up a dark entry to rest her weary limbs on a doorstep and think. her elbows on her knees, her face hidden in her hands, she tried to gather together and arrange her thoughts. But still every now and then she opened her hand to see if the paper were yet there. She got up at last. She had formed a plan, and had a course of action to look forward to that would satisfy one craving desire at least. The time was long gone by when there was much wisdom or consistency in her projects. It was getting late, and that was so much the better. She went to a pawn shop and took off her finery in a back room. She was known by the people, and had a character for honesty, so she had no very great difficulty in inducing them to let her have a suit of outer clothes befitting the wife of a working man, a black silk bonnet, a printed gown, a plaid shawl, dirty and rather worn to be sure, but which had a sort of sanctity to the eyes of the street walker as being the appropriate garb of that happy class to which she could never, never more belong. She looked at herself in the little glass which hung against the wall, and sadly shaking her head, thought how easy were the duties of that Eden of innocence from which she was shut out. How she would work and toil and starve and die, if necessary, for a husband, a home, for children, but that thought she could not bear. A little form rose up, stern in its innocence, from the witch's cauldron of her imagination, and she rushed into action again. You know now how she came to stand by the threshold of Mary's door, waiting, trembling, until the latch was lifted, and her niece, with words that spoke of such desolation among the living, fell into her arms. She had felt as if some holy spell would prevent her, even as the unholy Lady Geraldine was prevented, in the abode of Christabel, from crossing the threshold of that home of her early innocence, and she had meant to wait for an invitation. But Mary's helpless action did away with all reluctant feeling, and she dragged her to her seat, and looked on her bewildered eyes, as, puzzled with the likeness, which was not identity, she gazed on her aunt's features. In pursuance of her plan, Esther meant to assume the manners and character, as she had done the dress, of a mechanic's wife, but then, to account for her long absence, and her long silence towards all that ought to have been dear to her, it was necessary that she should put on an indifference far distant from her heart, which was loving and yearning in spite of all its faults. And, perhaps, she overacted her part, for certainly Mary felt a kind of repugnance to the changed and altered aunt, who so suddenly reappeared on the scene, and it would have cut Esther to the very core, could she have known how her little darling of former days was feeling towards her. "You don't remember me, I see, Mary," she began. "It's a long while since I left you all, to be sure, and I, many a time, thought of coming to see you, and your father. But I live so far off, and am always so busy, I cannot do just what I wish. You recollect Aunt Esther, don't you, Mary?" "Are you Aunt Hetty?" asked Mary faintly, still looking at the face which was so different from the old recollections of her aunt's fresh, dazzling beauty. "Yes, I am Aunt Hetty. Oh, it's so long since I heard that name," sighing forth the thoughts it suggested. Then, recovering herself, and striving after the hard character she wished to assume, she continued, "And today I heard a friend of yours, and of mine too, long ago, was in trouble. And I guessed you would be in sorrow, so I thought I would just step this far and see you." Mary's tears flowed afresh, but she had no desire to open her heart to her strangely found aunt, who had, by her own confession, kept aloof from and neglecting them for so many years. Yet she tried to feel grateful for kindness, however late, from any one, and wished to be civil. Moreover, she had a strong disinclination to speak on the terrible subject uppermost in her mind. So, after a pause, she said, "Thank you. I dare say you mean very kind. Have you had a long walk?" "I'm so sorry," she said, rising with a sudden thought, which was as suddenly checked by recollection, "but I've nothing to eat in the house, and I'm sure you must be hungry after your walk." For Mary concluded that certainly her aunt's residence must be far away on the other side of the town, out of sight or hearing. But, after all, she did not think much about her. Her heart was so aching full of other things, that all besides seemed like a dream. She received feelings and impressions from her conversation with her aunt, but could not put them together, or think or argue about them. And Esther! How scanty had been her food for days and weeks, her thinly covered bones and pale lips might tell, but her words should never reveal. So, with a little unreal laugh, she replied, "Oh, Mary, my dear, don't talk about eating. We've the best of everything, and plenty of it, for my husband is in good work. I'd such a supper before I came out. I couldn't touch a morsel if you had it." Her words shot a strange pang through Mary's heart. She had always remembered her aunt's loving and unselfish disposition. How was it changed, if, living in plenty, she had never thought it worth while to ask after her relations, who were all but starving? She shut up her heart instinctively against her aunt. And all the time poor Esther was swallowing her sobs, and overacting her part, and controlling herself more than she had done for many a long day, in order that her niece might not be shocked and revolted by the knowledge of what her aunt had become, a prostitute, an outcast. She had longed to open her wretched heart, so hopeless, so abandoned by all living things, to one who had loved her once, and yet she refrained, from dread of the averted eye, the altered voice, the internal loathing which she feared such disclosure might create. She would go straight to the subject of the day. She could not tarry long, for she felt unable to support the character she had assumed for any length of time. They sat by the little round table, facing each other. The candle was placed right between them, and Esther moved it in order to have a clearer view of Mary's face, so that she might read her emotions and ascertain her interests. Then she began. "It's a bad business, I'm afraid, this of Mr. Carson's murder." Mary winced a little. "I hear Jem Wilson is taken up for it." Mary covered her eyes with her hands, as if to shade them from the light, and Esther herself, less accustomed to self-command, was getting too much agitated for calm observation of another. "I was taking a walk near Turner Street, and I went to see the spot," continued Esther, "and, as luck would have it, I spied this bit of paper in the hedge," producing the precious piece still folded in her hand. "It has been used as wadding for the gun, I reckon. Indeed, that's clear enough, from the shape it's crammed into. I was sorry for the murderer, whoever he might be. I didn't then know of Jem's being suspected, and I thought I would never leave a thing about as might help, ever so little, to convict him. The police are so acute about straws. So I carried it a little way, and then I opened it and saw your name, Mary." Mary took her hands away from her eyes, and looked with surprise at her aunt's face as she uttered these words. She was kind after all, for was she not saving her from being summoned, and from being questioned and examined, a thing to be dreaded above all others, as she felt sure that her unwilling answers, frame them how she might, would add to the suspicions against Jem. Her aunt was indeed kind to think of what would spare her this. Esther went on without noticing Mary's look. The very action of speaking was so painful to her, and so much interrupted by the hard, raking little cough, which had been her constant annoyance for months, that she was too much engrossed by the physical difficulty of utterance to be a very close observer. "There could be no mistake if they had found it. Look at your name, together with the very name of this court, and in Jem's handwriting too, or I'm much mistaken. Look, Mary!" And now she did watch her. Mary took the paper and flattened it, then suddenly stood stiff up, with irrepressible movement, as if petrified by some horror abruptly disclosed, her face strung and rigid, her lips compressed tight, to keep down some rising exclamation. She dropped on her seat, as suddenly as if the braced muscles had in an instant given way. But she spoke no word. "It is his handwriting, isn't it?" asked Esther, though Mary's manner was almost confirmation enough. "You will not tell? You never will tell?" demanded Mary, in a tone so sternly earnest as almost to be threatening. "Nay, Mary," said Esther, rather reproachfully, "I am not so bad as that. Oh, Mary, you cannot think I would do that, whatever I may be." The tears sprang to her eyes at the idea that she was suspected of being one who would help to inform against an old friend. Mary caught her sad and upbraiding look. "No, I know you would not tell, aunt. I don't know what I say, I am so shocked. But say you will not tell, do." "No, indeed I willn't tell, come what may." Mary sat still, looking at the writing, and turning the paper round with careful examination, trying to hope, but her very fears belying her hopes. I thought you cared for the young man that's murdered, observed Esther, half aloud, but feeling that she could not mistake the strange interest in the suspected murderer implied by Mary's eagerness to screen him from anything which might strengthen suspicion against him. She had come, desirous to know the extent of Mary's grief for Mr. Carson, and glad of the excuse afforded her by the important scrap of paper. Her remark about its being Jem's handwriting she had, with this view of ascertaining Mary's state of feeling, felt to be most imprudent the instant after she had uttered it, but Mary's anxiety that she should not tell was too great and too decided to leave a doubt as to her interest for Jem. She grew more and more bewildered, and her dizzy head refused to reason. Mary never spoke. She held the bit of paper firmly, determined to retain possession of it, come what might, and anxious and impatient for her aunt to go. As she sat, her face bore a likeness to Esther's dead child. "You are so like my little girl, Mary," said Esther, weary of the one subject on which she could get no satisfaction, and recurring with full heart to the thought of the dead. Mary looked up. Her aunt had children, then? That was all the idea she received. No faint imagination of the love and the woe of that poor creature crossed her mind, or she would have taken her, all guilty and erring, to her bosom, and tried to bind up the broken heart. No, it was not to be. Her aunt had children, then, and she was on the point of putting some question about them, but before it could be spoken another thought turned it aside, and she went back to her task of unravelling the mystery of the paper and the handwriting. Oh, how she wished her aunt would go! As if, according to the believers in mesmerism, the intenseness of her wish gave her power over another, although the wish was unexpressed, Esther felt herself unwelcome, and that her absence was desired. She felt this some time before she could summon up resolution to go. She was so much disappointed in this longed-for, dreaded interview with Mary. She had wished to impose upon her with her tale of married respectability, and yet she had yearned and craved for sympathy in her real lot. And she had imposed upon her well. She should perhaps be glad of it afterwards, but her desolation of hope seemed for the time redoubled. And she must leave the old dwelling-place, whose very walls and flags, dingy and sordid as they were, had a charm for her. Must leave the abode of poverty, for the more terrible abodes of vice. She would go. "Well, good night, Mary. That bit of paper is safe enough with you, I see. But you made me promise I would not tell about it, and you must promise me to destroy it before you sleep." "I promise," said Mary hoarsely but firmly. "Then you are going?" "Yes. Not if you wish me to stay. Not if I could be of any comfort to you, Mary," catching at some glimmering hope. "Oh no," said Mary, anxious to be alone. "Your husband will be wondering where you are. Some day you must tell me all about yourself. I forget what your name is." "Fergusson," said Esther sadly. "Mrs. Fergusson," repeated Mary, half unconsciously. "And where did you say you lived?" "I never did say," muttered Esther. Then aloud, "In Angel's Meadow, 145 Nicholas Street." 145 Nicholas Street, Angel Meadow. I shall remember. As Esther drew her shawl around her and prepared to depart, a thought crossed Mary's mind that she had been cold and hard in her manner towards one who had certainly meant to act kindly in bringing her the paper, that dread, terrible piece of paper, and thus saving her from, she could not rightly think how much or how little she was spared. So desirous of making up for her previous indifferent manner, she advanced to kiss her aunt before departure. But, to her surprise, her aunt pushed her off with a frantic kind of gesture, and saying the words, "Not me, you must never kiss me, you!" she rushed into the outer darkness of the street, and there wept long and bitterly. End of chapter 21. Recording by Stephanie Dupal de Martin.
Mary Barton, Chapter 22. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell, Chapter 22. Mary's efforts to prove an alibi. There was a listening fear in her regard, as if calamity had but begun, as if the vanward clouds of evil days had spent their malice, and the sullen roar was, with its stored thunder, labouring up. Keats, Hyperion. No sooner was Mary alone than she fastened the door, and put the shutters up against the window, which had all this time remained shaded only by the curtains hastily drawn together on Esther's entrance, and the lighting of the candle. She did all this with the same compressed lips, and the same stony look that her face had assumed on the first examination of the paper. Then she sat down for an instant to think, and rising directly, went with a step rendered firm by inward resolution of purpose, up the stairs, past her own door, 2 steps, into her father's room. What did she want there? I must tell you, I must put into words the dreadful secret which she believed that bit of paper had revealed to her. Her father was the murderer. That corner of stiff, shining, thick writing paper she recognised as part of a sheet on which she had copied Samuel Bamford's beautiful lines so many months ago. Copied, as you perhaps remember, on the blank part of a valentine sent to her by Jim Wilson, in those days when she did not treasure and hoard up everything he had touched, as she would do now. That copy had been given to her father, for whom it was made, and she had occasionally seen him reading it over. Not a fortnight ago, she was sure, but she resolved to ascertain if the other part still remained in his possession. He might, it was just possible he might, have given it away to some friend, and if so, that person was the guilty one, for she could swear to the paper anywhere. First of all, she pulled out every article from the little old chest of drawers. Amongst them were some things which had belonged to her mother, but she had no time now to examine and try and remember them. All the reverence she could pay them was to carry them and lay them on the bed carefully, while the other things were tossed impatiently out upon the floor. The copy of Bamford's lines was not there. Oh, perhaps he might have given it away. But then, must it not have been to Jem? It was his gun. And she set to with redoubled vigour to examine the deal box, which served as chair, and which had once contained her father's Sunday clothes, in the days when he could afford to have Sunday clothes. He had redeemed his better coat from the pawn shop before he left, that she had noticed. Here was his old one. What rustled under her hand in the pocket? The paper! Oh, father! Yes, it fitted. Jagged end to jagged end, letter to letter, and even the part which Esther had considered blank had its tallying mark with the larger piece, its tails of Y's and G's. And then, as if that were not damning evidence enough, she felt again, and found some little bullets or shot, I don't know which you would call them, in that same pocket, along with a small paper parcel of gunpowder. As she was going to replace the jacket, having abstracted the paper and bullets, etc., she saw a woollen gun case, made of that sort of striped horse cloth you must have seen 1,000 times appropriated to such a purpose. The sight of it made her examine still further, but there was nothing else that could afford any evidence, so she locked the box and sat down on the floor to contemplate the articles, now with a sickening despair, now with a kind of wondering curiosity how her father had managed to evade observation. After all, it was easy enough. He had evidently got possession of some gun. Was it really Jem's? Was he an accomplice? No, she did not believe it. He never would deliberately plan a murder with another, however he might be wrought up to it by passionate feeling at the time. Least of all would he accuse her to her father without previously warning her. It was out of his nature. Then, having obtained possession of the gun, her father had loaded it at home, and might have carried it away with him some time when the neighbours were not noticing, and she was out or asleep. Then he might have hidden it somewhere to be in readiness when he should want it. She was sure he had no such thing with him when he went away the last time. She felt it was of no use to conjecture his motives. His actions had become so wild and irregular of late that she could not reason upon them. Besides, was it not enough to know that he was guilty of this terrible offence? Her love for her father seemed to return with painful force, mixed up as it was with horror at his crime. That dear father, who was once so kind, so warm-hearted, so ready to help either man or beast in distress, to murder? But in the desert of misery with which these thoughts surrounded her, the arid depths of whose gloom she dared not venture to contemplate, a little spring of comfort was gushing up at her feet, unnoticed at first, but soon to give her strength and hope. And that was the necessity for exertion on her part, which this discovery enforced. Oh, I do think that the necessity for exertion, for some kind of action, bodily or mental, in time of distress, is a most infinite blessing. Although the first efforts at such seasons are painful, something to be done implies that there is yet hope of some good thing to be accomplished, or some additional evil that may be avoided, and by degrees the hope absorbs much of the sorrow. It is the woes that cannot, in any earthly way, be escaped that admit least earthly comforting. Of all trite, worn-out, hollow mockeries of comfort that were ever uttered by people who will not take the trouble of sympathizing with others, the one I dislike the most is the exhortation not to grieve over an event, for it cannot be helped. Do you think if I could help it, I would sit still with folded hands, content to mourn? Do you not believe that as long as hope remained I would be up and doing? I mourn because what has occurred cannot be helped. The reason you give me for not grieving is the very and sole reason of my grief. Give me nobler and higher reasons for enduring meekly what my Father sees fit to send, and I will try earnestly and faithfully to be patient, but mock me not, or in any other manner, with the speech, "Do not grieve, for it cannot be helped, it is past remedy." But some remedy to Mary's sorrow came with thinking. If her father was guilty, Jem was innocent. If innocent, there was a possibility of saving him. He must be saved, and she must do it, for was not she the sole depository of the terrible secret? Her father was not suspected, and never should be, if by any foresight or any exertions of her own she could prevent it. She did not know how Jem was to be saved, while her father was also to be considered innocent. It would require much thought and much prudence, but with the call upon her exertions and her various qualities of judgment and discretion, came the answering consciousness of innate power to meet the emergency. Every step now, nay, the employment of every minute, was of consequence. For you must remember, she had learnt at Miss Simmonds' the probability that the murderer would be brought to trial the next week. And you must remember, too, that never was so young a girl so friendless or so penniless as Mary was at this time. But the lion accompanied Una through the wilderness and the danger, and so will a high resolved purpose of right doing ever guard and accompany the helpless. It struck too, deep murk night. It was of no use bewildering herself with plans this weary endless night. Nothing could be done before morning, and at first in her impatience she began to long for day. But then she felt in how unfit a state her body was for any plan of exertion, and she resolutely made up her mind to husband her physical strength. First of all, she must burn the tell-tale paper. The powder, bullets, and gun case she tied into a bundle, and hid in the sacking of the bed for the present, although there was no likelihood of their affording any evidence against anyone. Then she carried the paper downstairs, and burned it on the hearth, powdering the very ashes with her fingers, and dispersing the fragments of fluttering black films among the cinders of the grate. Then she breathed again. Her head ached with dizzying violence. She must get quit of the pain, or it would incapacitate her for thinking and planning. She looked for food, but there was nothing but a little raw oatmeal in the house. Still, although it almost choked her, she ate some of this, knowing from experience how often headaches were caused by long fasting. Then she sought for some water to bathe her throbbing temples and quench her feverish thirst, but there was none in the house, so she took the jug and went out to the pump at the other end of the court, whose echoes resounded her light footsteps in the quiet stillness of the night. The hard, square outlines of the houses cut sharply against the cold bright sky, from which myriads of stars were shining down in eternal repose. There was little sympathy in the outward scene with the internal trouble. All was so still, so motionless, so hard. Very different to this lovely night in the country in which I am now writing, where the distant horizon is soft and undulating in the moonlight, and the nearer trees sway gently to and fro in the night wind, with something of almost human motion, and the rustling air makes music among their branches, as if speaking soothingly to the weary ones, who lie awake in heaviness of heart. The sights and sounds of such a night lull pain and grief to rest. But Mary re-entered her home after she had filled her pitcher, with a still stronger sense of anxiety, and a still clearer conviction of how much rested upon her unassisted and friendless self. Alone with her terrible knowledge, in the hard, cold, populous world. She bathed her forehead and quenched her thirst, and then, with wise deliberation of purpose, went upstairs and undressed herself, as if for a long night's slumber, although so few hours intervened before day dawn. She believed she never could sleep, but she laid down and shut her eyes, and before many minutes she was in a deep and sound a slumber, as if there was no sin or sorrow in the world. She woke up, as it was natural, much refreshed in body, but with a consciousness of some great impending calamity. She sat up in bed to recollect, and when she did remember, she sank down again with all the helplessness of despair. But it was only the weakness of an instant, for were not the very minutes precious for deliberation, if not for action? Before she had finished the necessary morning business of dressing and setting her house in some kind of order, she had disentangled her ravelled ideas, and arranged some kind of plan for action. If Jem was innocent, and now of the guilt, even the slightest participation in or knowledge of the murder, she acquitted him with all her heart and soul. He must have been somewhere else when the crime was committed, probably with some others who might bear witness to the fact. If she only knew where to find them. Everything rested on her. She had heard of an alibi, and believed it might mean the deliverance she wished to accomplish, but she was not quite sure, and determined to apply to Job, as one of the few among her acquaintance gifted with the knowledge of hard words, for to her all terms of law or natural history were alike many-syllable mysteries. No time was to be lost. She went straight to Job Legh's house, and found the old man and his granddaughter sitting at breakfast. As she opened the door, she heard their voices speaking in a grave, hushed, subdued tone, as if something grieved their hearts. They stopped talking on her entrance, and then she knew they had been conversing about the murder, about Jem's probable guilt, and it flashed upon her for the first time, on the new light they would have obtained regarding herself. For until now they had never heard of her giddy flirting with Mr. Carson. Not in all her confidential talk with Margaret had she ever spoken of him, and now Margaret would hear her conduct talked of by all as that of a bold bad girl, and even if she did not believe everything that was said, she could hardly help feeling wounded and disappointed in Mary. So it was in a timid voice that Mary wished her usual good morrow, and her heart sunk within her a little, when Job, with a form of civility, bade her welcome in that dwelling, where until now she had been too well assured to require to be asked to sit down. She took a chair. Margaret continued silent. "I'm come to speak to you about Jem Wilson." "It's a bad business, I'm afeard," replied Job sadly. It's bad enough, anyhow, but Jem's innocent. Indeed he is, I am as sure can be." "How can you know, wench? Facts bear strong against him, poor fellow. Though he'd a deal to put him up and aggravate him, they say. Ay, poor lad, he's done for himself, I'm afeard." "Job," said Mary, rising from her chair in her eagerness, "you must not say he did it. He didn't, I am sure, and certain he didn't. Oh, why do you shake your head? Who is to believe me? Who is to think him innocent if you, who knowed him so well, stick to it he's guilty?" "I'm loath enough to do it, lass," replied Job, "but I think he's been ill-used, and jilted. That's plain truth, Mary, bare as it may seem, and his blood has been up. Many a man has done the like afore from these like causes. Oh, Job, then you won't help me? Job, to prove him innocent? Oh, Job, believe me, Jem never did harm to no one. Not afore, and mind, wench, I don't over blame him for this. Job relapsed into silence. Mary thought a moment. Well, Job, you'll not refuse me this, I know. I won't mind what you think, if you'll help me, as if he was innocent. Now suppose I knew he was innocent. It's only supposing. Job, what must I do to prove it? Tell me, Job, isn't it called an alibi, the getting folk to swear to where he really was at the time? Best way, if you knowed him innocent, would be to find out the real murderer. Someone did it, that's clear enough. If it wasn't Jem, who was it? How can I tell? Answered Mary in agony of terror, lest Job's question was prompted by any suspicion of the truth. But he was far enough from any such thought. Indeed, he had no doubt in his own mind that Jem had, in some passionate moment, urged on by slighted love and jealousy, been the murderer. And he was strongly inclined to believe that Mary was aware of this, only that, too late repentant of her light conduct, which had led to such fatal consequences, she was now most anxious to save her old playfellow, her early friend, from the doom awaiting the shedder of blood. If Jem's not done it, I don't see as any on us can tell who did it. We might find out something if we'd time, but they say he's to be tried on Tuesday. It's no use hiding it, Mary. Things look strong against him. I know they do. But, oh, Job, isn't it an alibi, proving where he really was at the time of the murder? And how must I set about an alibi? An alibi is that, sure enough. He thought a little. You mun ask his mother his doings and his whereabouts that night. The knowledge of that will guide you a bit. For he was anxious that on another should fall the task of enlightening Mary on the hopelessness of the case, and he felt that her own sense would be more convinced by inquiry and examination than any mere assertion of his. Margaret had sat silent and grave all this time. To tell the truth, she was surprised and disappointed by the disclosure of Mary's conduct with regard to Mr. Henry Carson. Gentle, reserved, and prudent herself, never exposed to the trial of being admired for her personal appearance, and unsusceptible enough to be in doubt even yet, whether the fluttering, tender, infinitely joyous feeling she was for the first time experiencing, at sight or sound, or thought of Will Wilson, was love or not. Margaret had no sympathy with the temptations to which loveliness, vanity, ambition, or the desire of being admired, exposes so many. No sympathy with flirting girls, in short. Then she had no idea of the strength of the conflict between will and principle in some who were differently constituted from herself. With her, to be convinced that an action was wrong was tantamount to a determination not to do so again, and she had little or no difficulty in carrying out her determination. So she could not understand how it was that Mary had acted wrongly, and had felt too much ashamed, in spite of internal sophistry, to speak of her actions. Margaret considered herself deceived, felt aggrieved, and at the time of which I am now telling you, was strongly inclined to give Mary up altogether as a girl devoid of the modest proprieties of her sex, and capable of gross duplicity in speaking of one lover as she had done of Jem, while she was encouraging another in attentions, at best of a very doubtful character. But now Margaret was drawn into the conversation. Suddenly it flashed across Mary's mind that the night of the murder was the very night, or rather the same early morning, that Margaret had been with Alice. She turned sharp round with, "Oh, Margaret, you can tell me. You were there when he came back that night. Were you not? No, you were not? But you were there not many hours after. Did not you hear where he'd been? He was away the night before, too, when Alice was first taken, when you were there for your tea." "Oh, where was he, Margaret?" "I don't know," she answered. "Stay, I do remember something about His keeping Will company in his walk to Liverpool. I can't justly say what it was. So much happened that night." "I'll go to his mother's," said Mary resolutely. They neither of them spoke, either to advise or dissuade. Mary felt she had no sympathy from them, and braced up her soul to act without such loving aid of friendship. She knew that their advice would be willingly given at her demand, and that was all she really required for Jem's sake. Still her courage failed a little as she walked to Jane Wilson's, alone in the world with her secret. Jane Wilson's eyes were swelled with crying, and it was sad to see the ravages which intense anxiety and sorrow had made on her appearance in 24 hours. All night long she and Mrs. Davenport had crooned over their sorrows, always recurring like the burden of an old song to the dreadest sorrow of all, which was now impending over Mrs. Wilson. She had grown, I hardly know what word to use, but something like proud of her martyrdom. She had grown to hug her grief, to feel an excitement in her agony of anxiety about her boy. "So, Mary, you're here! Oh, Mary, lass, he's to be tried on Tuesday." She fell to sobbing in the convulsive, breath-catching manner which tells so of much previous weeping. "Oh, Mrs. Wilson, don't take on so. We'll get him off, you'll see. Don't fret. They can't prove him guilty." "But I tell thee they will," interrupted Mrs. Wilson, half irritated at the light way, as she considered it, in which Mary spoke, and a little displeased that another could hope when she had almost brought herself to find pleasure in despair. "It may suit thee well," continued she, "to make light of the misery thou hast caused, but I shall lay his death at thy door as long as I live, and die I know he will, and all for what he never did. No, he never did, my own blessed boy." She was too weak to be angry long. Her wrath sank away to feeble sobbing and worn-out moans. Mary was anxious to soothe her from any violence of either grief or anger. She did so want her to be clear in her recollection, and besides, her tenderness was great towards Jem's mother. So she spoke in a low gentle tone the loving sentences which sound so broken and powerless in repetition, and which yet have so much power when accompanied with caressing looks and actions fresh from the heart. The old woman insensibly gave herself up to the influences of those sweet loving blue eyes, whose tears of sympathy, those words of love and hope, and was lulled into a less morbid state of mind. "And now, dear Mrs. Wilson, can you remember where he said he was going on Thursday night? He was out when Alice was taken ill, and he did not come home till early in the morning, or, to speak true, in the night, did he?" "Ay, he went out near upon 5. He went out with Will. He said he were going to set him a part of the way, for Will were hot upon walking to Liverpool, and wouldn't hearken to Jem's offer to lending him 5 shillings for his fare. So the 2 lads set off together. I mind it all now, but thou seest Alice's illness and this business of poor Jem's drove it out of my head. They went off together to walk to Liverpool. That's to say, Jem were to go part of the way. But who knows," falling back into the old desponding tone, "if he really went. He might be let off the road. Oh, Mary, they'll hang him for what he's never done." "No, they won't. They shan't. I see my way a bit now. We mun get Will to help. There'll be time. He can swear that Jem were with him. Where is Jem?" "Folks said he were taken to Kirkdale in the prison van this morning, without my seeing him. Poor chap! Oh, wench, they've hurried on the business at a cruel rate." "Ay, they've not let grass grow under their feet in hunting out the men that did it," said Mary sorrowfully and bitterly. "But keep up your heart. They got on the wrong scent when they took to suspecting Jem. Don't be afeard. You'll see it will end right for Jem." "I should mind it less if I could do aught," said Jane Wilson. "But I'm such a poor weak old body, and my head's so gone, and I'm so dazed like, what with Alice and all, that I think and think, and can do nought to help my child. I might have gone and seen him last night, they tell me now, and then I missed it. Oh, Mary, I missed it, and I may never see the lad again." She looked so piteously in Mary's face, with her miserable eyes, that Mary felt her heart giving way, and dreading the weakness of her powers, which the burst of crying she longed for would occasion, hastily changed the subject to Alice; and Jane, in her heart, feeling that there was no sorrow like a mother's sorrow, replied, "She keeps on much the same, thank you. She's happy, for she knows nothing of what's going on. But the doctor says she grows weaker and weaker. Thou'd maybe like to see her?" Mary went upstairs, partly because it was the etiquette in humble life to offer to friends at last opportunity of seeing the dying or the dead, while the same etiquette forbids a refusal of the invitation, and partly because she longed to breathe, for an instant, the atmosphere of holy calm, which seemed ever to surround the pious good old woman. Alice lay, as before, without pain, or at least any outward expression of it, but totally unconscious of all present circumstances, and absorbed in recollections of the days of her girlhood, which were vivid enough to take the place of reality to her. Still she talked of green fields, and still she spoke to the long dead mother and sister, low lying in their graves this many a year, as if they were with her and about her in the pleasant places where her youth had passed. But the voice was fainter, the motions were more languid. She was evidently passing away, but how happily! Mary stood for some time in silence, watching and listening. Then she bent down and reverently kissed Alice's cheek, and drew Jane Wilson away from the bed, as if the spirit of her who lay there were yet cognizant of present realities. She whispered a few words of hope to the poor mother, and kissing her over and over again in a warm, loving manner, she bade her good-bye, went a few steps, and then once more came back to bid her keep up her heart. And when she had fairly left the house, Jane Wilson felt as if a sunbeam had ceased shining into the room. Yet, oh, how sorely Mary's heart ached, for more and more the fell certainty came upon her that her father was the murderer. She struggled hard not to dwell on this conviction, to think alone on the means of proving Jem's innocence. That was her first duty, and that should be done. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of Mary Barton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 23. The Subpoena. And must it then depend on this poor eye and this unsteady hand, whether the bark that bears all my treasured hope and love shall find a passage through these frowning rocks to some fair port, where peace and safety smile, or whether it shall blindly dash against them, and miserably sink? Heaven be my help, and clear my eye, and nerve my trembling hand. The Constant Woman. Her heart beating, her head full of ideas which required time and solitude to be reduced into order, Mary hurried home. She was like one who finds a jewel, of which he cannot all at once ascertain the value, but who hides his treasure until some quiet hour when he may ponder over the capabilities its possession unfolds. She was like one who discovers the silken clue which guides to some bower of bliss, and secure of the power within his grasp, has to wait for a time before he may thread the labyrinth. But no jewel, no bower of bliss, was ever so precious to miser or lover, as was the belief which now pervaded Mary's mind that Jem's innocence might be proved without involving any suspicion of that other, that dear one, so dear, although so criminal, on whose part in this cruel business she dared not dwell even in thought. For if she did, there arose the awful question, if all went against Jem, the innocent, if judge and jury gave the verdict forth which had the looming gallows in the rear, what ought she to do, possessed of her terrible knowledge? Surely not to inculpate her father, and yet, she almost prayed for the blessed unconsciousness of death or madness, rather than that awful question should have to be answered by her. But now a way seemed opening yet more clear. She was thankful she had thought of the alibi, and yet more thankful to have so easily obtained the clue to Jem's whereabouts that miserable night. The bright light that her new hope threw over all seemed also to make her thankful for the early time appointed for the trial. It would be easy to catch Will Wilson on his return from the Isle of Man, which he had planned should be on the Monday, and on the Tuesday all would be made clear. All that she dared to wish to be made clear. She had still to collect her thoughts and freshen her memory enough to arrange how to meet with Will, for to the chances of a letter she would not trust, to find out his lodgings when in Liverpool, to try and remember the name of the ship in which he was to sail, and the more she considered these points, the more difficulty she found there would be in ascertaining these minor but important facts. For you were aware that Alice, whose memory was clear and strong on all points in which her heart was interested, was lying in a manner senseless; that Jane Wilson was, to use her own words, so expressive to a Lancashire ear, dazed, that is to say, bewildered, lost in the confusion of terrifying and distressing thoughts, incapable of concentrating her mind, and at the best of times Will's proceedings were a matter of little importance to her, or so she pretended. She was so jealous of aught which distracted attention from her pearl of price, her only son Jem. So Mary felt hopeless of obtaining any intelligence of the sailor's arrangements from her. Then should she apply to Jem himself? No, she knew him too well. She felt how thoroughly he must ere now have had it in his power to exculpate himself at another's expense, and his tacit refusal so to do had assured her of what she had never doubted, that the murderer was safe from any impeachment of his. But then neither would he consent, she feared, to any steps which might tend to prove himself innocent. At any rate, she could not consult him. He was removed to Kirkdale, and time pressed. Already it was Saturday at noon. And even if she could have gone to him, I believe she would not. She longed to do all herself, to be his liberator, his deliverer, to win him life, though she might never regain his lost love by her own exertions. No, how could she see him to discuss a subject in which both knew who was the blood-stained man, and yet whose name might not be breathed by either, so dearly, with all his faults, his sins, was he loved by both. All at once, when she had ceased to try and remember, the name of Will's ship flashed across her mind, the John Cropper. He had named it, she had been sure, all along. He had named it in his conversation with her that fatal Thursday evening. She repeated it over and over again, through a nervous dread of again forgetting it. The John Cropper. And then, as if she were rousing herself out of some strange stupor, she bethought herself of Margaret. Who so likely as Margaret to treasure every little particular respecting Will, now Alice was dead to all the stirring purposes of life? She had gone thus far in her process of thought, when a neighbour stepped in, she with whom they had usually deposited the house key, when both Mary and her father were absent from home, and who consequently took upon herself to answer all inquiries, and receive all messages which any friends might make or leave, on finding the house shut up. "Here's something for you, Mary. A policeman left it." A bit of parchment. Many people have a dread of those mysterious pieces of parchment. I am one. Mary was another. Her heart misgave her as she took it, and looked at the unusual appearance of the writing, which, though legible enough, conveyed no idea to her, or rather her mind shut itself up against receiving any idea, which after all was rather a proof that she had some suspicion of the meaning that awaited her. "What is it?" asked she, in a voice from which all the pith and marrow seemed extracted. "Nay, how should I know? Policeman said he'd call again towards evening, and see if you'd getten it. He were loath to leave it, though I telled him who I was, and all about my keeping the key, and taking messages." "What is it about?" asked Mary again, in the same hoarse, feeble voice, and turning it over in her fingers as if she dreaded to inform herself of its meaning. "Well, you can read every word of writing, and I cannot, so it's queer I should have to tell you. But my master says it's a summons for you to bear witness against James Wilson at the trial at Liverpool Assize." "God pity me," said Mary faintly, as white as a sheet. "Nay, wench, never take on so. What you can say will go little way either to help or to hinder, for folk say he's certain to be hung, and sure enough, it was t'other one as was your sweetheart." Mary was beyond any pang this speech would have given at another time. Her thoughts were all busy picturing to herself the terrible occasion of their next meeting. Not as lovers meet should they meet. "Well," said the neighbour, seeing no use in remaining with one who noticed her words or her presence so little, "thou'lt tell policeman thou'st getten his precious bit of paper. He seemed to think I should be keeping it for mysel. He's the first as has ever misdoubted me about giving messages or notes. Good day." She left the house, but Mary did not know it. She sat still with the parchment in her hand. All at once she started up. She would take it to Job Legh, and ask him to tell her the true meaning, for it could not be that. So she went and choked out her words of inquiry. "It's a subpoena," he replied, turning the parchment over with the air of a connoisseur, for Job loved hard words and lawyer-like forms, and even esteemed himself slightly qualified for a lawyer, from the smattering of knowledge he had picked up from an odd volume of Blackstone that he had once purchased at a bookstall. "A subpoena? What is that?" gasped Mary, still in suspense. Job was struck with her voice, her changed, miserable voice, and peered at her countenance from over his spectacles. "Ah, a subpoena is neither more nor less than this, my dear. It's a summonsing you to attend and answer such questions as may be asked of you regarding the trial of James Wilson for the murder of Henry Carson. That's the long and short of it, only more elegantly put for the benefit of them who knows how to value the gift of language. I've been a witness before time myself. There's nothing much to be afeared on. If they are impudent, why, just you be impudent, and give 'em tit for tat." "Nothing much to be afeared on," echoed Mary, but in such a different tone. "Ay, poor wench, I see how it is. It'll go hard with thee a bit, I dare say, but keep up thy heart. You cannot have much to tell him that can go either one way or the other. Nay, maybe thou may do him a bit o' good, for when they set eyes on thee, they'll see fast enough how he came to be so led away by jealousy, for thou'rt a pretty creature, Mary, and one look at thy face will let 'em into the secret of a young man's madness, and make 'em more ready to pass it over." "Oh, Job, and won't you ever believe me when I tell you he's innocent? And indeed I can prove it. He's with Will all that night. He was indeed, Job." "My wench, whose word hast thou for that?" said Job pityingly. "Why, his mother told me, and I'll get Will to bear witness to it. But oh, Job," bursting into tears, "it is hard if you won't believe me. How shall I clear him to strangers when those who know him and ought to love him are so set against his being innocent?" "God knows I'm not against his being innocent," said Job solemnly. "I'd give half my remaining days on earth. I'd give them all, Mary, and but for the love I bear to my poor blind girl, they'd be no great gift, if I could save him. You've thought me hard, Mary, but I'm not hard at bottom, and I'll help you if I can. That I will, right or wrong," he added, but in a low voice, and coughed the uncertain words away with the moment afterwards. "Oh, Job, if you will help me!" exclaimed Mary, brightening up, though it was but a wintry gleam after all. "Tell me what to say when they question me. I shall be so gloppened, I shan't know what to answer." Gloppened, terrified. "Thou canst do nought better than tell the truth. Truth's best at all times, they say. And for sure it is, when folk have to do with lawyers, for they're cute and cunning enough to get it out sooner or later, and it makes folk look like Tom Noddies when truth follows falsehood against their will. But I don't know the truth. I can't say rightly what I mean, but I'm sure if I were pent up and stared at by hundreds of folk, and asked ever so simple a question, I should be for answering it wrong, and if they asked me if I had seen you on a Saturday, or a Tuesday, or any day, I should have clean forgotten all about it, and say the very thing I should not. Well, well, don't go for to get such notions into your head. They're what they call narvous, and talking on 'em does no good. Here's Margaret, bless the wench! Look, Mary, how well she guides herself." Job fell to watching his granddaughter, as with balancing, measured steps, timed almost as if to music, she made her way across the street. Mary shrank as if from a cold blast, shrank from Margaret. The blind girl, with her reserve, her silence, seemed to be a severe judge. She, listening, would be such a check to the trusting earnestness of confidence, which was beginning to unclog the sympathy of Job. Mary knew herself to blame, felt her errors in every fibre of her heart, but yet she would rather have had them spoken about, even in terms of severest censure, than have been treated in the icy manner in which Margaret had received her that morning. "Here's Mary," said Job, almost as if he wished to propitiate his granddaughter. "Come to take a bit of dinner with us, and I'll warrant she's never thought of cooking any for herself to-day, and she looks as wan and pale as a ghost." It was calling out the feeling of hospitality so strong and warm in most of those who have little to offer, but whose heart goes eagerly and kindly with that little. Margaret came towards Mary with a welcoming gesture, and a kinder manner by far than she had used in the morning. "Nay, Mary, thou know'st thou's getten nought at home," urged Job; and Mary, faint and weary, and with a heart too aching full of other matters to be pertinacious in this, withdrew her refusal. They ate their dinner quietly, for to all it was an effort to speak, and after one or two attempts they had subsided into silence. When the meal was ended, Job began again on the subject they all had at heart. "Yon poor lad at Kirkdale will want a lawyer to see they don't pull on him, but do him justice. Hast thought on that?" Mary had not, and felt sure his mother had not. Margaret confirmed this last supposition. "I've but just been there, and poor Jane is like one dateless. So many griefs come on her at once. One time she seems to make sure he'll be hung, and if I took her in that way, she flew out, poor body, and said that in spite of what folks said, there were them as could and would prove him guiltless. So I never knew where to have her. The only thing she was constant in was declaring him innocent." "Mother-like," said Job. She meant Will when she spoke on them that could prove him innocent. He was with Will on Thursday night, walking a part of the way with him to Liverpool. Now the thing is to lay hold on Will and get him to prove this. So spoke Mary, calm, from the earnestness of her purpose. "Don't build too much on it, my dear," said Job. "I do build on it," replied Mary, "because I know it's the truth, and I mean to try and prove it, come what may. Nothing you can say will daunt me, Job, so don't you go and try. You may help, but you cannot hinder me doing what I'm resolved on." They respected her firmness of determination, and Job almost gave in to her belief when he saw how steadfastly she was acting upon it. Oh, surest way of conversion to our faith, whatever it may be, regarding either small things or great, when it is beheld as the actuating principle from which we never swerve, when it has seen that, instead of overmuch profession, it is worked into the life and moves every action. Mary gained courage, as she instinctively felt that she had made way with one at least of her companions. "Now I'm clear about this much," she continued. "He was with Will when the shot was fired." She could not bring herself to say, when the murder was committed, when she remembered who it was that she had every reason to believe was the taker away of life. "Will can prove this. I must find Will. He wasn't to sail till Tuesday. There's time enough. He was to come back from his uncle's in the Isle of Man on Monday. I must meet him in Liverpool on that day, and tell him what has happened, and how poor Jem is in trouble, and that he must prove an alibi come Tuesday. All this I can and will do, though perhaps I don't clearly know how just at present. But surely God will help me. When I know I'm doing right, I will have no fear, but put my trust in Him, for I'm acting for the innocent and good, and not for my own self, who have done so wrong. I have no fear when I think of Jem, who is so good." She stopped, oppressed with the fullness of her heart. Margaret began to love her again, to see in her the same sweet, faulty, impulsive, lovable creature she had known in the former Mary Barton, but with more of dignity, self-reliance, and purpose. Mary spoke again. "Now I know the name of Will's vessel, the John Cropper, and I know that she is bound to America. That is something to know, but I forgot, if I ever heard, where he lodges in Liverpool. He spoke of his landlady as a good, trustworthy woman, but if he named her name it has slipped my memory. Can you help me, Margaret?" She appealed to her friend, calmly and openly, as if perfectly aware of and recognizing the unspoken tie which bound her and Will together. She asked her in the same manner in which she would have asked a wife where her husband dwelt, and Margaret replied in the like calm tone, 2 spots of crimson on her cheeks alone bearing witness to any internal agitation. "He lodges at a Mrs Jones's milk-house yard, out of Nicholas Street. He has lodged there ever since he began to go to sea. She is a very decent kind of woman, I believe." "Well, Mary, I'll give you my prayers," said Job. "It's not often that I pray regular, although I often speak a word to God, when I'm either very happy or very sorry. I've catched myself thanking him at odd hours when I've found a rare insect, or had a fine day for an out. But I cannot help it, no more than I can talking to a friend. But this time I'll pray regular for Jem and for you. And so will Margaret, I'll be bound. Still, wench, what think you on a lawyer? I know one, Mr Cheshire, who's rather given to the insect line, and a good kind of chap. He and I have swapped specimens many's the time, when either of us had a duplicate. He'll do me a kind turn, I'm sure. I'll just take my hat and pay him a visit." No sooner said than done. Mary and Margaret were left alone, and this seemed to bring back the feeling of awkwardness, not to say estrangement. But Mary, excited to an unusual pitch of courage, was the first to break silence. "Oh, Margaret," said she, I feel how wrong you think I have acted. You cannot think me worse than I think myself, now my eyes are opened." Here her sobs came choking up her voice. "Nay," Margaret began, "I have no right to—" "Yes, Margaret, you have a right to judge. You cannot help it. Only in your judgment remember mercy, as the Bible says. You, who have always been good, cannot tell how easy it is at first to go a little wrong, and then how hard it is to go back. Oh, I little thought, when I was first pleased with Mr Carson's speeches, how it would all end. Perhaps in the death of him I loved better than life." She burst into a passion of tears. The feelings pent up through the day would have vent, but checking herself with a strong effort, and looking up at Margaret as piteously as if those calm, stony eyes could see her imploring face, she added, "I must not cry, I must not give way. There will be time enough for that hereafter, if... I only wanted you to speak kindly to me, Margaret, for I am very, very wretched. More wretched than any one can ever know. More wretched, I sometimes fancy, than I have deserved. But that's wrong, isn't it, Margaret? Oh, I have done wrong, and I am punished. You cannot tell how much." Who could resist her voice, her tones of misery, of humility? Who would refuse the kindness with which she begged so penitently? Not Margaret. The old friendly manner came back. With it, maybe, more of tenderness. "Oh, Margaret, do you think he can be saved? Do you think they can find him guilty if Will comes forward as a witness? Won't that be a good alibi?" Margaret did not answer for a moment. "Oh, speak, Margaret," said Mary, with anxious impatience. "I know nought about law or alibis," answered Margaret meekly. "But, Mary, as grandfather says, aren't you building too much on what Jane Wilson has told you about his going with Will? Poor soul, she's gone dateless, I think, with care and watching, and overmuch trouble, and who can wonder? or Jem may have told her he was going by way of a blind. "You don't know Jem," said Mary, starting from her seat in a hurried manner, "or you would not say so." "I hope I may be wrong. But think, Mary, how much there is against him. The shot was fired with his gun. He it was as threatened Mr. Carson not many days before. He was absent from home at that very time, as we know, and as I'm much afeard some one will be called on to prove, and there's no one else to share suspicion with him." Mary heaved a deep sigh. "But, Margaret, he did not do it," Mary again asserted. Margaret looked unconvinced. "I can do no good, I see, and by saying so, for none on you believe me. And I won't say so again until I can prove it. Monday morning I'll go to Liverpool. I shall be at hand for the trial. Oh dear, dear, and I will find Will, and then, Margaret, I think you'll be sorry for being so stubborn about Jem." "Don't fly off, dear Mary. I'd give a deal to be wrong. And now I'm going to be plain spoken. You'll want money. Them lawyers is no better than a sponge for sucking up money, let alone your hunting out Will, and your keeping Liverpool, and what not. You must take some of the mint I've got laid by in the old teapot. You have no right to refuse, for I offer it to Jem, not to you. It's for his purposes you're to use it." "I know, I see. Thank you, Margaret. You are a kind one at any rate. I'll take it for Jem, and I'll do my very best with it for him. Not all, though. Don't think I'll take all. They'll pay me for my keep. I'll take this," accepting a sovereign from the hoard which Margaret produced out of its accustomed place in the cupboard. "Your grandfather will pay the lawyer. I'll have nowt to do with him," shuddering as she remembered Job's words about lawyers' skill in always discovering the truth sooner or later, and knowing what was the secret she had to hide. "Bless you, don't make such a ado about it," said Margaret, cutting short Mary's thanks. "I sometimes thinks there's two sides to the commandment, and that we may say, 'Let others do unto you as you would do unto them,' for pride often prevents our giving others a great deal of pleasure in not letting them be kind, when their hearts are longing to help, and when we ourselves should wish to do just the same if we were in their place. Oh, how often I've been hurt, for being coldly told by persons not to trouble myself about their care or sorrow, when I saw them in great grief and wanted to be of comfort. Our Lord Jesus was not above letting folk minister to him, for he knew how happy it makes one to do out for another. It's the happiest work on earth." Mary had been too much engrossed by watching what was passing in the street to attend very closely to that which Margaret was saying. From her seat she could see out of the window very plainly, and she caught sight of a gentleman walking alongside of Job, evidently in earnest conversation with him, and looking keen and penetrating enough to be a lawyer. Job was laying down something to be attended to, she could see, by his uplifted forefinger and his whole gesture. Then he pointed and nodded across the street to his own house, as if inducing his companion to come in. Mary dreaded lest he should, and she should be subjected to closer cross-examination than she had hitherto undergone, as to why she was so certain that Jem was innocent. She feared he was coming. He stepped a little toward the spot. No, it was only to make way for a child tottering along, whom Mary had overlooked. Now Job took him by the button, so earnestly familiar had he grown. The gentleman looked fidging fain to be gone, but submitted in a manner that made Mary like him, in spite of his profession. Then came a volley of last words, answered by briefest nods and monosyllables, and then the stranger went off with a redoubled quickness of pace, and Job crossed the street with a little satisfied air of importance on his kindly face. "Well, Mary," said he on entering, "I've seen the lawyer. Not Mr. Cheshire, though. Trials for murder, it seems, are not his line of business. But he give me a note to another attorney, a fine fellow enough, only too much of a talker. I could hardly get a word in, he cut me so short. However, I've just been going over the principal points again to him. Maybe you saw us. I wanted him just to come over and speak to you himself, Mary, but he was pressed for time, and he said your evidence would not mean much either here nor there. He's going to the Sizes' first train on Monday morning, and will see Jem, and hear the ins and outs from him, and he's gived me his address. Mary and you and Will are to call on him, Will special, on Monday at 2 o'clock. Thou'rt taking it in, Mary? Thou'rt to call on him in Liverpool at 2 Monday afternoon." Job had reason to doubt if she fully understood him, for all this minuteness of detail, these satisfactory arrangements, as he considered them, only seemed to bring the circumstances in which she was placed more vividly home to Mary. They convinced her that it was real, and not all a dream, as she had sunk into fancying it for a few minutes, while sitting in the old accustomed place, her body enjoying the rest, and her frame sustained by food, and listening to Margaret's calm voice. The gentleman she had just beheld would see and question Jem in a few hours, and what would be the result? Monday, that was the day after tomorrow, and on Tuesday, life and death would be tremendous realities to her lover, or else death would be an awful certainty to her father. No wonder Job went over his main points again. "Monday at 2 o'clock, mind, and here's his card. Mr. Bridgenorth, 41 Renshaw Street, Liverpool. He'll be lodging there." Job ceased talking, and the silence roused Mary up to thank him. "You're very kind, Job, very. You and Margaret won't desert me, come what will." "Pooh, pooh, wench. Don't lose heart, just as I'm beginning to get it. He seems to think a deal on Will's evidence. You're sure, girls, you're under no mistake about Will?" "I'm sure," said Mary. "He went straight from here, purposing to go see his uncle at the Isle of Man, and be back Sunday night, ready for the ship sailing on Tuesday." "So am I," said Margaret, "and the ship's name was the John Cropper, and he lodged where I told Mary before. Have you got it down, Mary?" Mary wrote it on the back of Mr. Bridgenorth's card. "He was not over willing to go," said she as she wrote, "for he knew little about his uncle, and said he didn't care if he never knowed more, but he said kinsfolk was kinsfolk, and promises was promises, so he'd go for a day or so, and then it would be over." Margaret had to go and practice some singing in town. So, though loath to depart and be alone, Mary bade her friends good-bye. End of chapter 23 of Mary Barton.
Chapter 24 of Mary Barton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephanie Dupal de Martin. Mary Barton by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 24. With the Dying. O sad and solemn is the trembling watch of those who sit and count the heavy hours, beside the fevered sleep of one they love. O awful is it in the hushed midnight, while gazing on the pallid moveless form, to start and ask, is it now sleep or death? Anonymous. Mary could not be patient in her loneliness. So much painful thought weighed on her mind. The very house was haunted with memories and foreshadowings. Having performed all duties to Jem, as far as her weak powers, yet loving heart could act, and a black veil being drawn over her father's past, present, and future life, beyond which she could not penetrate to judge of any filial service she ought to render, her mind unconsciously sought after some course of action in which she might engage. Anything rather than leisure for reflection. And then came up the old feeling which first bound Ruth to Naomi, the love they both held towards one object, and Mary felt that her cares would be most lightened by being of use, or of comfort to his mother. So she once more locked up the house and set off towards Ancoats, rushing along with downcast head, and for fear lest anyone should recognize her and arrest her progress. Jane Wilson sat quietly in her chair as Mary entered, so quietly as to strike one by the contrast it presented to her usual bustling and nervous manner. She looked very pale and wan, but the quietness was the thing that struck Mary most. She did not rise as Mary came in, but sat still and said something in so gentle, so feeble a voice, that Mary did not catch it. Mrs. Davenport, who was there, plucked Mary by the gown, and whispered, "Never heed her. She's worn out, and best let alone. I'll tell you all about it upstairs." But Mary, touched by the anxious look with which Mrs. Wilson gazed at her, as if waiting the answer to some question, went forward to listen to the speech she was again repeating. "What is it? Will you tell me?" Then Mary looked and saw another ominous slip of parchment in the mother's hand, which she was rolling up and down in a tremulous manner between her fingers. Mary's heart sickened within her, and she could not speak. "What is it?" she repeated. "Will you tell me?" She still looked at Mary with the same childlike gaze of wonder and patient entreaty. What could she answer? "I telled you not to heed her," said Mrs. Davenport a little angrily. "She knows well enough what it is, too well belike. I was not in when they sarved it, but Mrs. Hemming, her as lives next door, was, as she spelled out the meaning, and made it all clear to Mrs. Wilson. It's a summons to be a witness on Jem's trial. Mrs. Hemming thinks to swear it to the gun, for you see there's no but her as can testify to its being his, and she let on so easily to the policeman that it was his, that there's no getting off her word now. Poor body! She takes it very hard, I dare say." Mrs. Wilson had waited patiently while this whispered speech was being uttered, imagining perhaps that it would end in some explanation addressed to her. But when both were silent, though their eyes without speech or language told their hearts' pity, she spoke again in the same unaltered gentle voice, so different from the irritable impatience she had been ever apt to show to every one except her husband, he who had wedded her, broken down and injured, in a voice so different, I say, from the old hasty manner she spoke now the same anxious words. "What is this? Will you tell me? You'd better give it to me at once, Mrs. Wilson, and let me put it out of your sight. Speak to her, Mary wench, and ask for a sight on it. I've tried and better tried to get it from her, and she takes no heed of words, and I'm loth to pull it by force out of her hands." Mary drew the little cricket out from under the dresser, and sat down at Mrs. Wilson's knee, and coaxing one of her tremulous, ever-moving hands into hers, began to rub it soothingly. There was a little resistance, a very little, but that was all, and presently, in the nervous movement of the imprisoned hand, the parchment fell to the ground. Mary calmly and openly picked it up, without any attempt at concealment, and quietly placing it in sight of the anxious eyes that followed it with a kind of spell-bound dread, went on with her soothing caresses. "She has had no sleep for many nights," said the girl to Mrs. Davenport, "and all this woe and sorrow, it's no wonder." "No, indeed," Mrs. Davenport answered. "We must get her fairly to bed. We must get her undressed, and all, and trust to God in His mercy to send her to sleep, or else." For, you see, they spoke before her as if she were not there, her heart was so far away. Accordingly, they almost lifted her from the chair in which she sat motionless, and taking her up as gently as a mother carries her sleeping baby, they undressed her poor, worn form, and laid her in the little bed upstairs. They had once thought of placing her in Jem's bed, to be out of sight or sound of any disturbance of Alice's, but then again they remembered the shock she might receive in awakening in so unusual a place, and also that Mary, who intended to keep vigil that night in the house of mourning, would find it difficult to divide her attention in the possible cases that might ensue. So they laid her, as I said before, on that little pallet bed, and, as they were slowly withdrawing from the bedside, hoping and praying that she might sleep, and forget for a time her heavy burden, she looked wistfully after Mary, and whispered, "You haven't told me what it is. What is it?" And gazing in her face for the expected answer, her eyelids slowly closed, and she fell into a deep, heavy sleep, almost as profound a rest as death. Mrs. Davenport went her way, and Mary was alone, for I cannot call those who sleep allies against the agony of thought which solitude sometimes brings up. She dreaded the night before her. Alice might die, the doctor had that day declared her case hopeless, and not far from death, and at times the terror so natural to the young, not of death, but of the remains of the dead, came over Mary, and she bent and listened anxiously for the long-drawn, pausing breath of the sleeping Alice. Or Mrs. Wilson might awake in a state which Mary dreaded to anticipate, and anticipated while she dreaded, in a state of complete delirium. Already her senses had been severely stunned by the full explanation of what was required of her, of what she had to prove against her son, her Jem, her only child, which Mary could not doubt the officious Mrs. Hemming had given, and what if in dreams, that land into which no sympathy or love can penetrate with another, either to share its bliss or its agony, that land whose scenes are unspeakable terrors, are hidden mysteries, are priceless treasures to one alone, that land where alone I may see, while yet I tarry here, the sweet looks of my dear child. What if, in the horrors of her dreams, her brain should go still more astray, and she should waken crazy with her visions and the terrible reality that begot them? How much worse is anticipation sometimes than reality! How Mary dreaded that night, and how calmly it passed by! Even more so than if Mary had not had such claims upon her care. Anxiety about them deadened her own particular anxieties. She thought of the sleepers whom she was watching, till, overpowered herself by the want of rest, she fell off into short slumbers, in which the night wore imperceptibly away. To be sure, Alice spoke, and sang during her waking moments, like the child she deemed herself, but so happily with the dearly loved ones around her, with the scent of the heather, and the song of the wild bird hovering about her in imagination, with old scraps of ballads or old snatches of primitive versions of the Psalms, such as are sung in country churches, half draperied over with ivy, and where the running brook or the murmuring wind among the trees makes fit accompaniment to the chorus of human voices uttering praise and thanksgiving to their God, that the speech and the song gave comfort and good cheer to the listener's heart, and the grey dawn began to dim the light of the rush candle, before Mary thought it possible that day was already trembling in the horizon. Then she got up from the chair where she had been dozing, and went, half asleep, to the window to assure herself that morning was at hand. The streets were unusually quiet with the Sabbath stillness. No factory bells that morning, no early workmen going to their labours, no slipshod girls cleaning the windows of the little shops which broke the monotony of the street. Instead, you might see here and there some operative sallying forth for a breath of country air, or some father leading out his wee toddling bairns for the unwonted pleasure of a walk with daddy, in the clear frosty morning. Men with more leisure on week-days would perhaps have walked quicker than they did through the fresh, sharp air of this Sunday morning, but to them there was a pleasure, an absolute refreshment in the dawdling gait they, one and all of them, had. There were, indeed, one or two passengers on that morning whose objects were less innocent and less praiseworthy than those of the people I have already mentioned, and whose animal state of mind and body clashed jarringly on the peacefulness of the day, but upon them I will not dwell, as you and I, and almost every one, I think, may send up our individual cry of self-reproach that we have not done all that we could for the stray and wandering ones of our brethren. When Mary turned from the window, she went to the bed of each sleeper to look and listen. Alice looked perfectly quiet and happy in her slumber, and her face seemed to have become much more youthful during the painless approach to death. Mrs. Wilson's countenance was stamped with the anxiety of the last few days, although she, too, appeared sleeping soundly. But as Mary gazed on her, trying to trace a likeness to her son in her face, she awoke and looked up into Mary's eyes, while the expression of consciousness came back into her own. Both were silent for a minute or two. Mary's eyes had fallen beneath that penetrating gaze, in which the agony of memory seemed every minute to find fuller vent. "Is it a dream?" the mother asked at last in a low voice. "No," replied Mary in the same tone. Mrs. Wilson hid her face in the pillow. She was fully conscious of everything this morning. It was evident that the stunning effect of the subpoena, which had affected her so much last night in her weak, worn-out state, had passed away. Mary offered no opposition when she indicated by languid gesture and action that she wished to rise. A sleepless bed is a haunted place. When she was dressed, with Mary's aid, she stood by Alice for a minute or two looking at the slumberer. "How happy she is," she said quietly and sadly. All the time that Mary was getting breakfast ready, and performing every other little domestic office she could think of, to add to the comfort of Jem's mother, Mrs. Wilson sat still in the armchair, watching her silently. Her old irritation of temper and manner seemed to have suddenly disappeared, or perhaps she was too depressed in body and mind to show it. Mary told her all that had been done with regard to Mr. Bridgenorth, all her own plans for seeking out Will, all her hopes, and concealed as well as she could all the doubts and fears that would arise unbidden. To this Mrs. Wilson listened without much remark, but with deep interest and perfect comprehension. When Mary ceased, she sighed and said, "Oh, wench, I am his mother, and yet I do so little, I can do so little. That's what frets me. I seem like a child as sees its mammy ill, and moans and cries its little heart out, yet does naught to help. I think my sense has left me all at once, and I can't even find strength to cry like the little child." Hereupon she broke into a feeble wail of self-reproach, that her outward show of misery was not greater, as if any cries or tears or loud-spoken words could have told of such pangs at the heart as that look and that thin, piping, altered voice. But think of Mary and what she was enduring. Picture to yourself, for I cannot tell you, the armies of thoughts that met and clashed in her brain, and then imagine the effort it cost her to be calm and quiet, and even in a faint way cheerful and smiling at times. After a while she began to stir about in her own mind for some means of sparing the poor mother of the trial of appearing as a witness in the matter of the gun. She had made no allusion to her summons this morning, and Mary almost thought she must have forgotten it, and surely some means might be found to prevent that additional sorrow. She must see Job about it, nay, if necessary, she must see Mr. Bridgenorth, with all his truth-compelling powers. For indeed she had so struggled and triumphed, though a sadly bleeding victor at heart, over herself these 2 last days, had so concealed agony and hidden her inward woe and bewilderment, that she began to take confidence, and to have faith in her own powers of meeting any one with a passably fair show, whatever might be rending her life beneath the cloak of her deception. Accordingly, as soon as Mrs. Davenport came in after morning church, to ask after the 2 lone women, and she had heard the report Mary had to give, so much better as regarded Mrs. Wilson than what they had feared the night before it would have been. As soon as this kind-hearted, grateful woman came in, Mary, telling her purpose, went off to fetch the doctor, who attended Alice. He was shaking himself after his morning's round, and happy in the anticipation of his Sunday's dinner, but he was a good-tempered man, who found it difficult to keep down his jovial easiness even by the bed of sickness or death. He had mischosen his profession, for it was his delight to see every one around him in full enjoyment of life. However, he subdued his face to the proper expression of sympathy befitting a doctor listening to a patient, or a patient's friend, and Mary's sad, pale, anxious face might be taken for either the one or the other. "Well, my girl, and what brings you here?" said he, as he entered his surgery. "Not on your own account, I hope?" "I wanted you to come and see Alice Wilson, and then I thought you would maybe take a look at Mrs. Wilson." He bustled on his hat and coat, and followed Mary instantly. After shaking his head over Alice, as if it was a mournful thing for one so pure and good, so true, although so humble a Christian, to be nearing her desired haven, and muttering the accustomed words intended to destroy hope, and prepare anticipation, he went, in compliance with Mary's look, to ask the usual questions of Mrs. Wilson, who sat passively in her armchair. She answered his questions, and submitted to his examination. "How do you think her?" asked Mary eagerly. "Why, began he, perceiving that he was desired to take one side in his answer, and unable to find out whether his listener was anxious for a favourable verdict or otherwise, but thinking it most probable that she would desire the former, he continued, "She is weak, certainly, the natural result of such a shock as the arrest of her son would be. For I understand this James Wilson, who murdered Mr. Carson, was her son. Sad thing to have such a reprobate in the family." "You say, who murdered, sir," said Mary indignantly. "He is only taken up on suspicion, and many have no doubt of his innocence. Those who know him, sir." "Ah, well, well, doctors have seldom time to read newspapers, and I dare say I'm not very correct in my story. Dare say he's innocent. I'm sure I had no right to say otherwise. Only words slip out. No, indeed, young woman, I see no cause for apprehension about this poor creature in the next room. Weak, certainly, but a day or two's good nursing will set her up. And I'm sure you're a good nurse, my dear, from your pretty kind-hearted face. I'll send a couple of pills in a draught, but don't alarm yourself. There's no occasion, I assure you." "But you don't think her fit to go to Liverpool?" asked Mary, still in the anxious tone of one who wishes earnestly for some particular decision. "To Liverpool, yes," replied he. "A short journey like that couldn't fatigue, and might distract her thoughts. Let her go by all means. It would be the very thing for her." "Oh, sir," burst out Mary, almost sobbing, "I did so hope you would say she was too ill to go." "Whew!" said he, with a prolonged whistle, trying to understand the case, but being, as he said, no reader of newspapers, utterly unaware of the peculiar reasons there might be for so apparently unfeeling a wish. "Why did you not tell me so sooner? It might certainly do her harm in her weak state. There is always some risk attending journeys, draughts, and what not. To her they might prove very injurious. I disapprove of journeys or excitement in all cases where the patient is in the low, fluttered state in which Mrs. Wilson is. If you take my advice, you will certainly put a stop to all thoughts of going to Liverpool." He really had completely changed his opinion, though quite unconsciously, so desirous was he to comply with the wishes of others. "Oh, sir, thank you! And will you give me a certificate of our being unable to go if the lawyer says he must have one? The lawyer, you know," continued she, seeing him look puzzled, "who was to defend Jem, it was as a witness against him." "My dear girl," said he almost angrily, "why did you not state the case fully at first? 1 minute would have done it, and my dinner waiting all this time. To be sure she can't go, it would be madness to think of it. If her evidence could have done good, it would have been a different thing. Come to me for the certificate any time, that is to say, if the lawyer advises you. I second the lawyer. Take counsel with both learned professions. Ha, ha, ha!" And laughing at his own joke, he departed, leaving Mary accusing herself of stupidity in having imagined that every one was as well acquainted with the facts concerning the trial as she was herself. For indeed she had never doubted that the doctor would have been aware of the purpose of poor Mrs. Wilson's journey to Liverpool. Presently she went to Job, the ever-ready Mrs. Davenport keeping watch over the 2 old women, and told him her fears, her plans, and her proceedings. To her surprise he shook his head doubtfully. "It may have an awkward look if ye keep her back. Lawyers is up to tricks." "But it is no trick," said Mary. "She is so poorly, she was last night so, at least, and to-day she's so faded in a week." "Poor soul, I dare say. I only mean for Jem's sake, and so much is known, it won't do now to hang back. But I'll ask Mr. Bridgenorth. I'll even take your doctor's advice. You tarry at home, and I'll come to you in an hour's time. Go thy ways, wench." End of chapter 24.